Welcome to the Accounting Arc Podcast, where analysis, reaction, and comedy collide to tackle the big topics from the world of accounting and beyond. Join our trio of transformation agents as they discuss the hottest topics in and out of the profession, from breaking down industry trends, to reacting to everyday events, to uncovering the hidden humor in numbers. With wisdom, insight, and a dash of levity, they're proving that accounting isn't just about the numbers. It's about life. Because after all, accounting is in everything. The Accounting Arc Podcast starts now.
Welcome to another episode of the ARC Podcast. We are excited to talk about a very current topic that is pretty much everywhere you look, Agentic AI, and talk about what it is, because there's so much talk about AI. I think understanding what is meant when we talk about agentic AI is very important. And then just all of the conversation around it, like what could it mean? What is it? How's it going to affect the accounting profession? All questions that I think are bouncing around in everybody's mind. So we're excited to talk about it today. I'd love to hear one of your thoughts as to how you describe agentic AI, because this is one thing that I hear through all the podcasts and through various social media. There are different perspectives as to what is meant by agentic AI.
I'll take the first stab because I know Liz has the complex one. So the way I think of it simply, it comes back to the words agentic, so formed from agent. So agentic AI is an AI that can utilize other AIs or use other agents to perform different tasks, and it basically is coordinating these tasks as our agent, as the end user's agent. So that's why all this agent stuff starts to come in. So I'm giving the agentic AI a task. It breaks that task apart, gives it to the best AIs that do each of those things, whether they're generative or not, and then it comes back with a answer or analysis and provides that to us. That's the way I think of it. Liz, correct me.
No, I think that's a really wonderful way to describe it from a high level. I would just elaborate on it a little bit and say the way people are talking about and thinking about agentic AI is almost a one-to-one ratio to a human, right? So let's think about if we had an autonomous worker, right? Which generally speaking, humans are autonomous workers, right? Like we know what our job duties are. We get trained over time. We know what we're supposed to take care of. If there is a trigger that happens, let's say we get an email, we know we respond. We know the resources we have at our availability to respond, and we use our own brains all the time to do that, right? And so the way people are thinking about agentic AI is training autonomous bots in the role of this agent. And so what you're saying, Donny, is totally right? You have an agent that can use all this other AI as well as what it's been trained on to perform its task, let's say. The piece I would add to it is that it is autonomously doing what it's supposed to be doing at all times, right? And so, humans go to sleep, like we take vacations. We are not all 24/7, 365 or 66 days a year, depending on the year, right? We're human. We need time to recharge and refresh and figure these things out. And so the way people are talking about agentic AI is this one-to-one autonomous bot ratio where you get this basically full-time, all-time, no questions asked, doing autonomous tasks, monitoring for triggers, and performing job duties effectively. So it's a very interesting concept.
Yeah, and I think where it gets murky is probably in the understanding of what these tasks are that agents are doing, because in today's state of technology, the tasks are fairly small tasks, very specific tasks that are being performed. And I think the hope is that there's a future where the agents can take on more tasks to do things. But in today's state, with the developments of generative AI and, of course, all AI, being able to kind of chain together an ensemble of tools in order to perform very specific tasks is kind of what gets exciting, because there's a lot of things we do throughout the day that aren't necessarily things we get excited to do. They're just kind of necessary things that have to happen. And two, there's things that a lot of times are bottlenecks for our human progress in order to get things done. So if we have these agents working, 24/7, 365, uncorking those bottlenecks, it really should enable just a huge jump in productivity for us humans.
Right. That's where I thought Liz was going when she started doing the one-on-one, because it's not like, because I agree, a lot of people talk about it, oh, you'll have this assistant, right? This AI assistant that'll do all this stuff for you, but it's not just that assistant, it's all the other agents and AI that it has access to. And then, yeah, like Liz said, it's like the normal person is probably working a third of the day, but these will keep working all 24 hours round.
Well, I think that it's a really interesting concept, right? Because you have to train the agents, and they are not like generative AI, where they have, a language model behind them to begin with. I mean, they do, but in a different way, right? Like a really good example of generative AI in what you would think of merging onto agentic space would be like a chatbot for a website, right? Like you can program a chatbot, but it's on top of a generative model and it's responding specifically to this one trigger and doing this one thing. Whereas the agentic AI has all these other pieces of, the business or whatever you're programming it for. And so the tasks that it's performing are based on what you want it to do. And so you're giving it access to all these models. So not just one, but multiple, as well as all these other areas of, integration with applications you use in your business, or, anything, like literally anything else you can think of, you could program into it. And so that's where the power of it is not a one-to-one, right? And so what I get frustrated with is the way it's marketed and talked about as, oh, replace an employee. Well, first off, I think that's BS. Like AI is never going to replace humans in the way that, it's being marketed to replace it. Yes, it can do tasks, it can perform trigger-based things, it can monitor and, in a way, think about things in a different way, but it's not going to be able to employ empathy or become human in the creative way that our brains are capable of, or at least not anytime soon, right? But I do agree that this is not a one-to-one replacement or ratio. And the reason that it's being talked about that way is because it's easier for people to absorb if they have an idea, because people think in, generally speaking, most people think in two dimensions, right? And so they're not capable of grasping additional dimensions. And so you have to really stretch people's brains to get them to think outside of 3 dimensions into 4 or 5 or unlimited, right? And this is an unlimited dimensionality type topic where you can take this one thing and you can start to creatively have it in all of these other dimensions. Now, the piece that I do agree with is these agents should be hyper focused on, one thing or topic or task or department or piece of it, because if you start getting too broad based, it becomes a very interesting, almost like black box issue where you're not really sure what output you're going to get.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point about replacing humans, it's likely to replace tasks that we perform, but it's not going to replace an entire human. And that also goes back to capturing these tasks that are being performed or processes. And frankly, I think one of the things that's going to impede implementation of agentic AI, frankly, is the lack of process that most organizations have. Because if you don't have clear defined process, you can't string together the AIs and the automations and the APIs to even create a flow of anything if it's just kind of a bunch of people running in circles doing random things at random moments.
And that's all three of us have been probably for the last 10, 15 years been telling people standardize your process, and then you can automate it. So totally agree with you, Byron. There, the other thing that I think distinguishes this um, is the fact that you don't have to tell it how to break things apart. That was the thing that kind of impressed me, was because part of what we've been seeing, especially over the last maybe year and a half, is this prompt engineering has become a science, and it's become this separate skill. But when this agentic comes in, you can give it the simple ask, and it actually goes and analyzes that and figures, well, this is really what they mean to ask me. Break that into what is the bigger probably prompt, and then take that and divide that to each of these specialized bots, as Liz is saying. And so that was where I went, whoa, that's a little scary, because now it's starting to interpret what it thinks I actually want. Hopefully it is actually what I want. But then it starts to go and have all these other bots start doing all these things. And that's where I think that reach, and like Byron saying, that integration is where it does start to get scary, because what happens if it goes rogue?
Well, and they will, right? Like that's what training is for. But also when you're training humans, people go rogue too. So like let's
Right.
think back to accounting firms, right? Like most large accounting firms have very structured training programs where they say, okay, your first 2 weeks are new hire training, right? And you're learning the processes for this particular firm, the software for this particular firm. And you might get into some technical training as well, right? Like each firm has a different way they, interpret tax law or audit requirements or this or that, right? And so all of these agentic AIs will also need to be trained on those materials. And so when you start talking about going rogue or thinking about what happens, like the implications of that, you put guardrails up, right? So in a human process, you have a reviewer. In an agentic process, you have a reviewer that's going to make sure the decisions being made are good before they go forward. Where in an engagement, you might have a weekly meeting with everybody on the audit team where you sit down and you go over what are we doing this week, who's doing what, who's making what decision, what does this look like? Well, when you start employing agentic AI in audit, which I think is coming very quickly, you will have to have those guardrails in place and say, okay, so we're going to assign you this section for the audit. Go collect all the information, get everything done. But before it gets signed off on, we have a reviewer, we have a process, we have a meeting, and implementing those guardrails that are very, very important to ensure that we're not just sending AI loose in places where it may or may not be making good decisions and has access to a lot of information and the ability to influence a lot of different systems, right?
Yeah, and I think the fun part of agentic AI is this idea that you can actually have agents along the path doing some of that QC check to, there's in a world of, like, let's say a marketing process, you may have an agent that is uh, creating social media posts, and then a second agent that is reviewing those posts for, maybe grammar and clarity, and a third agent that maybe is scoring that post based on different social scores or some rubric that's defined. And you could have an additional agent that's actually just doing that quality control to make sure it's not offensive or any of these other things based on the rubric that's defined. So there's kind of this unlimited possibilities when you think about the ability to chain these agents together and put so many different little steps in process. It really kind of just blows your mind when you really think about the possibilities of what we can do that is so far beyond what we do as humans today.
So, Byron, can you elaborate on why you would chain agentic AI versus have it all built into one?
Well, so when I think of agentic AI, I think of it as it's this kind of collision of automation and artificial intelligence. And in the world of automation that has, I've been building zaps or make scenarios for years where each step in the process, there's a defined step that happens. So now with agents, we can create very singular intentional steps and leverage different AI models that are best geared for that job. There may be an AI model that's good at creativity. There may be another AI model that is really good for calculations. So you can kind of create this ensemble of, think of them as like individuals on an assembly line, each with one very specialized role, but it's really just individual agents that are geared to do that specific task.
Like that.
Exactly. And those models are so different depending on how they're trained, where they come from, what their intention was. And I think there's a lot of confusion right now about how do you decide what model to use in what place, and how do you decide what's best in class. And if we go back to your, marketing process workflow as your example, right? Well, we know that when you're training a model, any model that you're training, generative or agentic or any kind of language model, it is condensing information, right? So it's taking the broad base of the internet, let's say, or whatever training materials that you're giving it, and it's condensing it mathematically so that it's getting the gist of everything and learning that to accelerate the time frame, which in turn condenses biases, right? And condenses bigotry that's out there on the internet, right? Or that exists in the training model. And so you have a lot of data scientists spending a lot of ethical time thinking about how do we adapt for this? How do we clean the data in a way that it doesn't exacerbate these already existing issues in the way that information is available on the internet? But it's not done yet, and it's still there. And so you might have one agent that uses a model that has some not great stuff trained into it, and it might come up with a post that is totally not okay, not PC,
Yep.
should never be posted. And then you could have a QC bot that actually knows what to look for when it's trying to, ensure that it's falling within social norms and it's not going to offend a whole lot of people, right? And so having different models behind those agents becomes crucial to make sure that they're performing in the way that you want.
I think this is the other thing. Totally agree with that. And what we also need to clarify, though, because Byron keeps describing it as sort of a serial process, but we got to bring in Liz's multidimensionality back because it's not happening in a serial process. It's happening in, okay, boom, go. And like they're all going and working in parallel and then coming back and like, okay, here's the answer. So rather than it being just this thing that's going along, it's like create all the different posts for all the different audiences and then kind of test them out, like kind of Liz is saying, figure out which ones are actually okay and bring all of those back. And now which one of these is actually the best one? And then that's what we're actually giving, or we may even empower it to post it on our behalf. So it's
Right.
that whole multi-dimensionality that Liz brings is the power because it's not a one-to-one.
And it's very cool when you start looking at the iterative process that it takes. And so, it is doing all the things all at once and then coming back with an answer. And so it's like you trigger a process and it goes and then comes back, right? And whether or not that works depends on all sorts of things, right? There are so many ways that this can fail, and there are also so many ways that you can win with it. So, what are some ways that you guys see this affecting the accounting industry in the near term?
I love that you took it that way because the way that you described that immediately took me to audit. Because we learned that audit is this iterative process, right? Planning, risk assessment. Based upon the risk assessment, I start to do testing. Based upon the results of testing, I determine if I need to do more testing or if I go in a different direction. And this whole concept of, okay, put the plan in, I can see the bots going, as you described, test everything, come back and go, we've tested all this first round. Where do we see risk? Okay, now go again, figure out where's that next round, come back until it actually can form a conclusion. Oh, that's kind of scary to think that we could like completely automate audit, something like
I-
that.
You're exactly right. That was the first place that my mind goes is audit, and this idea that with, potentially unlimited agents, there's a real world where, 100% audit, I think is realistic. So I think that's one of those places. But then I do think about tax preparation and even accounting. There are so many individual tasks that can be agentified and carried out in a process where humans don't need to see them. And if you have that agent that's just looking at each transaction and scoring it, and basically anything below a specific level gets to a human, but everything else goes right through. I mean, it really is actually overwhelming to actually think about all the places where agents could come into the standard accounting processes to help us create financials.
There's also the concept of, I mean, the 100% audit, right, is a concept. Also, the continuous audit is another concept that
Yep.
we've been talking about for years, right? I mean, right now we have this very formal close process that then turns into an audit process. And, it's old. It's a very old process, and it's based on regulations, and it's based on a whole lot of manual processes. It's based on systems and processes that existed before we even used computers for our accounting records. And so when you start thinking about the possibilities, not just with agentic AI, but with just computer modeling in general, there are a lot of ways that this can go. We need legislation to change. We need regulations to change. We need people to have more understanding of how different models work and how computer programs in general work. And that is very slow to change in accounting. However, the rate of change and the rate of development of technology has hockey sticked. And the rate of
Yep.
change and the rate of development in our industry has maintained a very slow increase line. And so the gap between where we were and where we are is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so I think that there's going to be a lot that comes out of the AI CPA in the next few years, talking about what updates need to happen, how to even utilize technology in an ethical and a way that abides by the regulations that we have to ensure that these audits are done right. And I think that we're going to move into more of a continuous audit where we have agentic AI potentially, or even just other models employed with base level general ledger systems, consistently looking at every transaction and marking risk and marking potential fraud and marking anything out of the ordinary, and doing it in a way that could get elevated to another model of AI or could get elevated to a human or some combination thereof.
Totally
Yeah,
agree.
I absolutely agree. I was fortunate to be part of a task force from the AICPA about 12, 13 years ago. It was initially the Future of Peer Review Task Force. It turned into the Enhancing Audit Quality Task Force. But I can remember having conversations in those meetings about the possibilities of what technology was going to be accessible to us in what I considered to be the near future. And that was just as simple as consuming a lease and actually extracting the critical information to apply lease standards to it, or those types of things. And at the time, it was so science fiction for the people in the room that they couldn't even begin to think about changing peer review standards or audit standards to allow for that type of stuff to happen. And so now that in the last 2 years, we've had such an acceleration, we went from, the opportunity to maybe be a little ahead of the curve to being incredibly far behind the curve of what is going to be possible in the very near future and today.
It's funny you say that. I just spoke for a student, a master's class last week, and one of the diagrams I brought up was one that I created when I was part of ASEC in 2011, which was the future of audit and assurance. And I had the continuous audit piece in there as well, and all of these changes, and it felt like it was so futuristic back then. And I'm like, this is all starting to happen. Before we bridge off of this, I wanted to make sure we also included the tax people, because I always feel like we forget about tax with technology. And the other part, because we've been talking about this agentic a lot as tasks, but the other thing that I thought was really cool with this was scenario running or scenario analysis. And so really kind of looking at it, think of it in a tax planning situation where you're like, well, let's figure out which, if I've got a multi-entity or a family-owned business that has potential for partial consolidations or cross-entity or multi-entity tax situations where maybe I want to combine or sometimes I don't want to combine. And you could just feed it all this information and it will go and run, well, what if we did this? And what if we did that? And what if we did this? And what if we, and it just runs all these scenarios. And then it comes back to you with the analysis and says, well, here's the different tax situations under each of these scenarios. These are the ones that we think are the most favorable. If the entity is planning to do this, then that, like all of this type of logic to just project out what's going to happen becomes possible not in days, but in minutes.
Yeah.
That was one of the ones that blew my mind when that was posed. I was like, oh my gosh, the possibility for planning, not just in tax, but even in the FP&A world in finance, was like, that's scary.
We
Oh,
will see it
absolutely.
first in FP&A
Yep.
because FP&A models are much easier to analyze, right? They're known things. There's ways to do the math. It's a much easier concept in terms of projecting that out. Now, the secondary layer in FP&A, which is economic influence and understanding what's going to happen to the business, that is way more complicated and way more interesting, and requires a level of modeling that I don't think exists quite yet in terms of being able to look at trends, current date, political influence, news, everything, and tell you what's going to happen in 1 month, 1 year, whatever that is. So that's coming. That's really interesting. Tax has two foundational issues, and I think we probably need a whole episode on tax technology because there are some significant issues with it and with adopting technology with it. And I would say, just from a summary perspective, two foundational issues, one being the current tax engines are old. And we don't have a lot of people creating new ones. And the reason being is because you have 50 states with 50 different tax laws. Some of those states have local tax laws that are different as well. The federal government changes the tax code on a monthly basis. It might be one small section, but it might be something else. We also have the problem of the actual IRC does not dictate what you do with tax or what the outcomes should be. So then you have the IRC, Internal Revenue Code, then you have the regulations on top of it that are supposed to expound upon it. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Then you have case law on top of that. And you have so many levels of issues and interpretations, and you go into all of the pronouncements by the IRS and their different information out there, their audit manuals, their internal letters, there's just so many layers of information you have to sift through to get to a good answer, and in many cases those are contradictory. And then those can be contradictory at the federal level, and you still have to analyze the state level. And so these two major issues, one being the technology is outdated and it's difficult to update, and there are no good integrative tax technologies that you could put an agent on top of to do this right now. And then on top of it, just the complexity of building a new one and the complexity of the way that tax law is actually administered in this country creates a situation where tax technology will lag for a considerable amount of time until we can get to a point where we can program new tax engines and interpret all 10 sources of information about one specific line in the IRC to be able to give a good answer on what that scenario will result in for any given circumstance.
As you describe it, I tend to think we're probably closer to that possibility than most people realize with, obviously, coding is becoming one of those things that generative AI is getting really, really good at, and consuming information and making sense of it. So if you combine that with the coding abilities, I don't see why the possibility of having, something that could be updated very quickly in the near future from a tax calculation engine perspective couldn't be possible.
It is possible. It's all possible. There's a lot of other problems in doing it, though, and it requires a ton of expertise that individuals have when you're sitting at a time where hiring somebody trained in tax to understand pieces of it is so difficult. So from a quality control perspective and a risk perspective, it is not something people are taking on right now, or at least not with a ton of money backing them. And I think I would know if there was a huge, probably, I would say, over $100 million raise to build this effectively in the way that it has to be built, even with current technology. That might change in 6 months. But I would say it is 100% possible. It is just the level of detail and the level of complexity that's there makes it very expensive and difficult to do. And then the secondary issue with building a new one is you have very large corporations playing in this space and protecting their turf, which means that when anybody gets something significant, they get purchased and either integrated into one of the existing tax models or just closed down. And that has been continuously happening over the last 20 years. So it's a very competitive space, very big money players behind it, very difficult to do. While theoretically it's possible, it's not happening fast enough.
No doubt. No doubt. Well, I think this conversation we can probably revisit quarterly and have enough information to continue to update the audience on. But this is a fun conversation that I think, without a doubt is going to have some significant impact and influence on the way all of us operate day to day here in the near future. So thanks for having this conversation today.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
The Center for Accounting Transformation provides business professionals with a network for utilizing innovations that are ready for adoption, the training and resources necessary to apply those innovations, and an opportunity to engage the talent and community needed to further the pursuit of innovative accounting practices that drive responsible and mindful business performance. Find out more at our website, www.improvetheworld.net. And if you're interested in sharing your own transformation stories, please contact us there.